everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on Here With Us, Parish Guide to Serving People with Dementia. My name is Joseph Sinisak. I'm the Publishing Director for Novalis Publishing, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Glad to have you with us. We have a lot of people here today from all across Canada. It's great to be here, and we're looking forward to a very exciting discussion this afternoon. Just a few words about the webinar before we really get into things, however. First of all, it is a co-publication or a co-presentation by Novalis Publishing, which I represent, and the Catholic Register. And I want to thank the Catholic Register for all their help in pulling this together this afternoon and getting the word out about it. You might be wondering why we are doing a webinar on serving people with dementia. I think there are a lot of different compelling reasons. We will be getting into those this afternoon. Just a few thoughts to start, though. It certainly would come as no surprise to anyone involved in parish life across North America that we are an aging community. It's also no secret that one of the biggest challenges for us, both as church and as a larger society, that we're dealing with dementia in all its forms. So, to give some thought to that, to give some reflection on it, to talk about how it's affecting us, especially at a parish level, we brought together this afternoon a panel to discuss what it means in practical terms, in theological terms, in pastoral terms, as we continue to live life in our parishes, our homes, and communities. This becomes an even more essential discussion, I would say, as we start to make our way out of the pandemic and begin to rebuild the communities that we all want to have face-to-face once again. I'd like to introduce our panel today. First, we have Michael Swan. I've known Michael for many, many years, and in fact, had the privilege of hiring him some years ago for the Catholic Register as a journalist. He is, or I should say, over the years, he's become an award-winning journalist. He's author of several books, including this most recent one, Here With Us. He has an MA in journalism from New York University, a BA in English literature from the University of Toronto. He is based here in Toronto. Then we have Father John Sullivan. Father John is pastor of the large downtown Toronto parish of Our Lady of Lourdes. He's worked in pastoral ministry in Jamaica, the Philippines, Manitoulin Island. He'd spent his summers directing Camp Econ for Kids, which is 2 hours drive north of Toronto. Many of you would probably have heard of it. Some of you may have been there. Father John takes over this fall as pastor of St. Pius X in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thirdly, we have Dr. Moira McQueen. She hardly needs an introduction. Many of you know her from her work as the executive director of the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute, based here in Toronto at the University of St. Michael's College campus. And she's also a member of the International Theological Commission, which advises the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican on emerging theological issues. So those are our panelists. Welcome all three to our discussion this afternoon. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to start things off just by posing some questions to each of our panelists so we can delve into the issues and start to unpack them a bit. I'm going to start with Michael. So I think this is a bit of a ballpark kind of question, but it allows us to really get into things. Why is this topic so important that it deserves the attention that we're giving it in a webinar, that we've given it in a book, that we're seeing everywhere? Michael, why are we talking about this today?
I think the importance of the subject is something that sort of emerged for me as I was writing. When you begin to think about the kinds of numbers that we're talking about, 500,000 people right now in Canada living with dementia, 50,000 people right now living in hospitals with dementia, 2/3 of the residents of all the nursing homes in the country have some degree of dementia. Um, the and these numbers are going to grow um, over the next decade. We're going to nearly double the number of people with dementia. There'll be nearly 1 million. Um, and, you know, it's a difficult and complex medical condition, but it's also existentially just frightening. And none of us want to confront it. We're faced with this obliteration of ourselves. We have to ask who we are when we don't know who these people are who've come to visit us, our family, our friends, who we are when we don't remember where we were yesterday or last week, or, where we're going, what we're doing. Um, it scares us, and anything that scares us, I think our tendency is to just pull back and say, I'll deal with that later. So I think the urgency of this is partly the numbers, but partly the way we feel about this.
I'm going to ask you now, I mean, what dimension of this is a particular issue for churches? It's certainly an issue for all of us as a
Yeah.
society. Why are we talking about it in the context of churches?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to sort of define what the role of churches is, because I think it's quite fair to look at this and say, well, we're talking about a medical condition. That's for the healthcare system. And indeed it is, and we shouldn't go around pretending to be doctors or gerontologists or occupational therapists, or, you know, those are areas of very specific skill. But it does seem to me that, you know, how we know and welcome people, whatever their limitations in life, that's that's the very definition of a pastoral problem. And and those people are either there in the pews or they're not in the pews, and we're conveniently ignoring them. So yeah, the one of the things I say in the book here is that, you know, there comes a point in the story of Jesus where he says, I call you friends. And that, it seems to me, carries great weight. If a parish doesn't have an aptitude for friendship, a capacity for friendship, a capacity for friendship that goes beyond those with whom it's convenient to be friends with, then I don't think we're doing anything. And I don't think we really have a Christian community. A capacity for friendship ought to define what a parish is.
It's interesting. It reminds me in some ways of the lessons of L'Arche and what they have taught us over the decades. You bring an interesting perspective to this because you're not a doctor. You're not a gerontologist. You're not a psychologist. You're a journalist.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I know in another interview you did, you were asked this question, and certainly we at Novalis approached you to write this book because of the specific gifts that you bring to it. How do you think being a journalist helped you approach this subject in a way that perhaps would be different from how, say, a doctor would do it, or in any kind of specialty?
Well, I think the craft of journalism, what a writer has to do is cultivate a certain empathy for people, and it, you know, when you ask questions every day, when you sort of sharpen a curiosity about how other people live, how other people understand the world. It equips you, I think, um, to see the problem from different angles and different dimensions. So yes, in the book, I spend a great deal of time talking about the science, what we know so far about this disease medically. I spend time thinking about what a parish is from the perspective of the scripture. And also I take a look at the liturgy. You know, the thing that a journalist has to do is sort of be the mediator for all of these different things. And this is such a complex problem, socially, scientifically, medically, that nobody from any one discipline could possibly encompass it. So in some ways, this convenient outsider who, you know, has a talent for asking questions, has this possibility of encompassing the problem. I should say also, though, that none of us is untouched by any of this. I spent time when I was a Jesuit novice long ago, volunteering in a nursing home, mostly on the dementia ward of that nursing home. I watched my grandmother go through this in her last couple of years of life. I watched my mother go through this in her last years. This is part of being alive today. And so I think part of this is to be a journalist and to ask questions and to try and marshal information in a digestible form. Part of this is just being human.
No, I think that's an essential point. You know, it has touched so many of us. At some point in our lives, we know someone, or we are close to someone in our family that we're dealing with. Very few of us are untouched by this issue. Tell me this: as you were doing your research for this book, were there any challenges in particular that struck you as something that churches are really struggling to deal with?
I think what we struggle to deal with is we struggle to pull ourselves out of our normal routine, and you know, parishes sort of run on us. You know, there's mass every day, there's confessions, there's a whole series of prayer groups and meetings and things that we do. To pull back from that, I think, is difficult, and we often don't have the mechanisms. We always talk about involving lay people and, you know, and outreach and so on. But I think it's really difficult actually for any of us to actually do that when the parish seems to be running along just fine, getting things done. You know, getting the youth group meeting scheduled, and getting the first communions done and the RCIA program running. How exactly do you begin a conversation about this? How exactly do you select a group of people to think about the parish and its challenges with dementia? That's not very clear, really. It's not laid out for us.
Oh, well, and that's what we're dealing with here. Thanks. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to jump to Father John now to explore what it's like on the ground in a particular parish. And I know Our Lady of Lourdes, it's an inner city Toronto parish. It's multiculturally very diverse, economically very diverse, I would say as well. And you were telling me earlier, Father John, that you've been there about 10 years now.
Right.
How has this become an issue in your parish? Have you seen it develop over the years? Talk about that a little bit.
For sure. I would say beginning when I first came here in 2012, I had some concern with regard to outreach or ministry with the elderly from my previous assignment where I was in parish priest in Jamaica. And I just happened to come across this book by the Catholic journalist American John Allen called The Future Church. And he looked at different trends, if you're not familiar with the book. And one of them was the place or the ministry with regard to the elderly. And he spoke of a few things that made an impression on me. The first thing was, in a sense, in my own words, this is God's vineyard. And we have an aging population in the West. And it's not as if this is just by happen chance, stance, I should say, but rather it is the realization of God's will. And so that was one thing that struck me, because sometimes, certainly in church environments, as Michael was saying, when you look at different groups to focus on, oftentimes it is relative. We look to the young, like youth groups or sacramental preparation for younger people as well. And it's not that you would neglect that, but with regard to those who are aging, the elderly, those with dementia, oftentimes there wasn't, at least from my experience, a great emphasis with regard to the concern that church community had in terms of its outreach. The second thing would be early on in my time at Our Lady of Lourdes, as I got to know more and more people, maybe even doing some home visits and things like that, especially with regard to the more elderly members of our community, I would say I began to feel bad, like I began to feel guilty that I would go and visit people, and maybe not exclusively dementia, but it may be a greater physical weakness or infirmity or another illness, but certainly for many of them, some stage of dementia. And I would hear stories of how long they had been a member of the parish at Our Lady of Lourdes, 30, 40, 50 years. And I was like 5 months or something like that. And I felt bad, I felt guilty that there was a sense, here's a group of people who have so long serve the church in this particular parish at Our Lady of Lourdes. And when, for whatever reason, they could no longer attend or they weren't as present with regard to volunteering or what have you, in a sense, it seemed like the parish community was saying, thank you for everything and goodbye and good luck. And I just really felt that is not the response, obviously, that should be coming from us. So certainly at Our Lady of Lourdes in my 10 years, yes, indeed, this is an issue, be it with regard in general, the aging population within a parish community, and also more particularly with regard to dementia. I would say, yes, it has certainly come to the fore in different ways.
How has the pandemic affected that? Has it exacerbated it in any number of ways?
Yes and no. The pandemic, one thing that the pandemic did early on was it gave us an opportunity to begin to kind of walk the talk, if you will, is that we immediately, like a lot of churches, through the telephone, wanted to make contact with people. In particularly, we organized a group of volunteers in the church from their homes, and we tried to come up with a list of people who we felt were a particular concern with regard probably to their age, to their health, and their probably their need for assistance, even with regard to groceries and things like that. So the pandemic gave us an opportunity to begin this initiative, this ministry at the parish. The pandemic has also affected us, obviously, like anything, those of that age group, they hear the doctors or the experts say, you want to stay as away from others or crowds as can be, with regard to the danger of transmission of the virus. And so many have indeed followed what the doctors have said and have stayed more or less home. So in one sense, physically, they're safer, but I think kind of emotionally, psychologically, there's greater loneliness, there's greater sense of isolation, there's greater sense of the world has forgotten me, even my own church has forgotten me. So we tried and continue to try to reach out to those people. Also, in terms of what's inspiring or edifying, oftentimes some of those who do come to the church, like Our Lady of Lourdes now in this lockdown, we're open 8 hours a day for private prayer. There's 2 hours of confessions that's available, and also the Eucharist is available for people after they have their prayer. And we probably get around 200 people a day who come for that. And many of them are the ones, you know them and you sort of know their background, you know their age, you know their health, and you think, good Lord, you're part of that group who shouldn't be coming too much around a crowd or other people. And yet their faith, what have you, they have to come to the church and do their prayers. And certainly many experiences of people and receiving the Eucharist, especially just the power of that for people, especially if they've been without it for some time. Very beautiful. People receive it and maybe they even break down in tears. So I think the pandemic definitely, of course, has had an effect. The church here has tried different things to reach out, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. But at least that in those attempts, I think a big thing would be that people would not think that the church has forgotten them, or that God has forgotten them. Certainly not. We don't want anyone to ever have that feeling, of course.
No, indeed. That's a remarkable number, actually, when you're saying 200 people a day are turning up in the church for prayer.
Yeah.
And a hopeful number. I find that very encouraging for all of us, actually. If I could take you back a little bit before the pandemic, did you find you had to make any kind of physical alterations or changes in the way you were doing, say, liturgy to deal with this?
There were two things we did. The first thing was maybe 4 years ago, Our Lady of Lourdes, a wonderful church, but it's 3 buildings over the years that were attached. And so it can sometimes be a bit of a maze to try and find where some room is. Also, people have been here for a long time, many, and so we refer to them by sort of their lesser known names, but if you're part of the in-group, you know exactly what it is. So we had very bad signage throughout the church, and so we wanted the church to be more welcoming for those who are new to the church, but also those perhaps who may have some difficulty with regard to dementia. So things are much better labeled, direction arrows and things like that. So that was one thing that we did. With regard to the liturgy, no, we haven't changed too much, or nothing at all really, in terms of a response to an issue like we have in Michael's book. Other than I always sort of talk slowly and prolong the Mass. I guess I do it naturally. So not so much. We're blessed that Our Lady of Lourdes is a parish community, and given our location, people are flexible. People are patient. It's not uncommon for people to come in off the street, off Sherburne, and maybe raise their voice or maybe behave in a way that we don't expect. Again, people I find at Our Lady of Lourdes in general, very, very understanding, very patient. And I think Michael talked about that in his book as well, with his example of the deacon in Ottawa and his wife. And just in terms of an anecdote, I remember a Jesuit priest, Father Eric McLean. You may have, people may have met him. He was president of Loyola High School in Montreal, and I taught there as part of my formation. And he told the story. His mother was in a long-term care center in Montreal, and she very proudly had organized that he would come and say Mass on Christmas Day. And so he was saying the Mass, and he said the homily. And as he sat down after the homily for that more prolonged, pregnant pause, so the profundity of his words could be received by all, he heard in the room someone say, "This is boring, turn the channel." And he would tell that story with great delight. And I think that as well, going with regard to this ministry and seeking to care for people as part of the community, I think, sort of that patience or flexibility, that humility, also delighting in, the human condition and even the fragility of the human condition. Is very necessary, and we can certainly see that at Lourdes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's fascinating. I wonder, you've read Michael's book.
Yeah.
Did anything jump out at you in particular that you might find helpful in your work in the parish?
I would say the main thing that jumped out at me from Michael's book was a sense of urgency. Actually, was a sense of urgency. At the beginning, going through the statistics and in the different chapters and different topics that he covered, it's just so easy, and he implied it in his closing remarks from his previous questions, that it's easy for the church to take the easiest route possible, to keep things running smoothly, to keep sort of the trains running on time. And yet, again, as a parish community, friendship, relationship, care, love, there is for us a sense of urgency to ensure that within the flock, people are not being overlooked. People are not being overlooked by negligence, or for myself, like a sense even of laziness of just trying to take the shortest route possible, but to make sure rather that we're caring for each other through God's grace as much as we can. So that was what I took really, that this topic, there was for me a sense of urgency.
That certainly comes across in any reading of the book, I find, especially in the early chapters. Michael does draw that out quite well. I'm going to ask Dr. Moira McQueen to jump in here as well, because Moira's Institute is the kind of place people go to for answers on ethical questions, and especially going on the history and traditions of the church. So I'm going to ask Moira if you can help us, especially all those people out there that say work for parishes, either in a volunteer capacity or professional capacity. Are there places they can go to for help on these kinds of issues?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and this is, people talk about sort of closely guarded secrets. And I think it's a really important part of Michael's, raising awareness about this whole issue. That first of all, it's about care for the people with dementia, but it's also about the carers and the people who have to deal with the people who have dementia. And I think there's probably more answers for the carers, because as Michael pointed out, the people with dementia, in terms of treatment, that kind of care will be more medical, naturally, but then the human care is from us. And so carers have a great burden in many cases to carry. But there are so many areas where we can point people to. They're not all religious, of course, and they don't have to be. But we get so much information on websites from places like hospices or the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Society. Although I'm saying palliative care, the same resources certainly go towards caring for people with dementia as well. It's generic resources. The CCCB has some resources. My own institute carries lists of resources. But I think the hospitals themselves and St. Elizabeth Healthcare has a wonderful site in terms of resources for this. Michael mentions Providence in his book, and honestly, I haven't looked at their website, but I would imagine that a really interesting place where people could turn to, either to get help or to be pointed towards other sources. So there's something that really fascinated me actually was that Michael mentioned the Alzheimer's Society itself, and that they said that they hadn't had an inquiry from a Catholic parish or a Catholic diocese. And that was kind of shocking to me. I suppose though perhaps some people have contacted them and perhaps didn't identify themselves as Catholic, because the main thing would be that they would be wanting information. But that particular type of group is, they're the best placed for practical information, psychological help, all those kinds of things. They point to places for respite care and, so places where people can go to for daily help. So many of the larger hospitals with geriatric provisions can point people towards those sorts of places as well. And so can many family physicians. Some of them are very well placed to help people. But I think sometimes when there's a diagnosis at the beginning, I think many of us feel a little bit helpless. This is a bigger problem than we were expecting. And it can seem, as if you're just moving along in small steps. But in fact, and I think this is where the parish dimension could certainly feature in a much stronger way than it has so far. And Michael, again, is raising that very important point about people in parishes also being involved, both for carers and for maybe people with early stage dementia who are still coming to the liturgy. So there are, I think, I'm just thinking of a place like Hamilton Diocese. They have a compassionate care committee, and they collected all sorts of resources for different parts of the diocese. It's just names and addresses lists, but those are very, very practical help. And Pallium Canada is one of the most important organizations, both in helping people to find help, actual help, medical and visiting help, as well as respite care for carers. So there's the idea of having something like a parish committee that could at least gather resources and just be a general resource for their own parishioners would be something that wouldn't be too taxing to do. I know it's always work, but it's not impossible. And it's not like reinventing the wheel, because there would be many sources, to draw from. And to have that available just in one's own parish website or some other format, a little booklet, as I know some churches have done, then I think there are many ways to do it, yeah.
That's interesting. I like the idea of the booklet itself. It strikes me, obviously this is a pastoral question for parishes. Is there a theological dimension to it that would help perhaps enrich our reflection on this? Is it a theological question?
Yeah, essentially it is. I think as soon as you use the word care, we're talking whole theology. We're talking about, first of all, the very basic part of our own faith, where we would point to the Good Samaritan type idea, the idea that we are responsible for our neighbor, the idea that, as both Michael and Father John have already mentioned, about the love that you expect, and not just for people in your parishes, but the love that is the very basic commandment that we all have as Christians. So this is part of who we are. We don't always put it into practice, but we know that theologically it's there in spades. And I think recent theology, perhaps especially with Pope Francis stressing the whole idea of accompaniment, is really, really vital these days. I think that has struck a chord in people, because that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that this is something we all can do. We don't have to be professionals. We don't have to, have special diplomas or anything like that. When it comes to caring for people and seeing to what in fact is their most basic needs, which is sort of being welcomed and being looked after, cared for, then we're all already equipped to do that. And sometimes I think we just need maybe a channel to help us actually do it. And I think he's, in a sense, it's highly theological, again, because accompaniment goes back to looking after your neighbor, or a Thomas Aquinas focus on we're responsible not just for our own flourishing, but also for the common good. So we have all these pointers that I think could really, just point us again in that direction, that, yeah, we have a responsibility towards other people in our parish, and that makes it sound like a duty. But it's deeper than that. It's not really a burden if we're called to love people. We're called to love people, and that should never be seen just as a responsibility. It's something that comes with being Christian.
It's interesting. You alluded to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Of course, that was a prime motif in Fratelli Tutti last fall,
Yeah.
the encyclical of Pope Francis. And
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, well, and again, you're right. I mean, in terms of nearly all his work, from the synods and the family onwards, and possibly before that too. I mean, he really has been stressing this, and it's something I love about this particular Pope, that most of the things that he calls on us to do, it's not anything that's way beyond us. It's very much areas within our own capacity and areas, if you like, right in our own parish. So, I mean, in many ways, for those of us who are church attenders, you don't get any more local than that. There's a place to be exercising, if you like, or develop some of these characteristics right where we already are. We don't have to go looking for it.
No. It's. I'd like to draw actually Michael and Father John into this question as well. The notion of the theological aspect of this and where we draw on our spiritual nourishment for this kind of care. Any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a wonderful sort of Canadian story about the theology of care. And it's, I kind of allude to it in the book. There was a wonderful sister of St. Martha down in Nova Scotia, taught nursing. It was a very respected professor of nursing at St. Francis Xavier in Antigonish. She eventually was given the Order of Canada. She was asked back in the 80s to write the first, or to organize writing the first code of ethics for nursing. And the insight that she had from that exercise was that what makes us human is caring. And so her code of ethics was essentially a kind of way of thinking about all the ways in which we care. And when I think about that, I also think that care for our common home, care for one another, is really a way of participating in the Trinity. That, Aquinas says that that the oneness of the Trinity is in the love expressed and shared between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But one way of thinking of that love is care. Because the creation doesn't just happen and stop. God creates our world, and he keeps creating it by caring for us, by caring for his world. And so I think that caring is how we relate to God and how we relate to each other, because if we don't relate to each other, we're not relating to God. So, so there's, I think that's an important sort of thing. And that's, I think, why I wanted us to highlight that maybe the first thing that a parish should do is go out and find out who's caring for somebody with dementia. Find out who in your parish lives with or goes every day or every week to the nursing home to visit a relative, a friend, a parent. Caring is what is the theological action here.
Thank you. Thank you. Father John?
Yes, sort of echoing both Moira and Michael, it reminds, at Our Lady of Lourdes, Michael attends there so he could attest to it. In my preaching, I'm a bit of a broken record. I always, in my faith, the love of God is so central. And so the tune I play with regard to the broken record is, of course, that personal, passionate, incomprehensible love of the Father for us, revealed to us in Christ. But our experience of the love of God, it must move to action. We can't just love and then lock the box and say, it's all for me. But rather, love impels us, it moves us to love back. St. Ignatius of Loyola, there is the giving of love from God to the beloved sinner, and then there is the beloved sinner then seeking to love God back. And so our loving of God back, caring, serving, has to be central in the living of our Catholic Christian faith, especially to those in the greatest need. Michael talked about from St. John Paul II with regard to that encyclical he wrote on the 100th anniversary of the previous Rerum Novarum. And again, the poor, caring for those in greatest need. Those with dementia, again, should be very high up on that list with regard to people of concern and people who are part of the community whom we cannot neglect.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all three for contributing on that question. We have quite a few questions popping up in the Q&A from a lot of our attendees, and I'd like to get to some of them. Some of them are actually quite practical. So I'm going to jump to a couple of those now. One of our guests asked whether you have a parish nurse at Our Lady of Lourdes. Now, that of course raises another question. Would parish nurses be a help for this kind of thing?
At Lourdes, we used to have one. We had one in my time. She had reached an age where she basically sort of retired from that. I guess for me, I read in the book as well, Michael used that example with regard to a parish nurse. I just had that one experience of it here. So just that one experience was sort of towards the end of her time. So I would say a committee providing help within the parish community, I think could be equally helpful with regard to just giving guidance, as Moira was speaking about different resources and things like that. Because I find like there's a clinic just up the street from us. There's lots of resources in the neighborhood that we could network with and sort of cooperate with regard to the care of the people in the church and the care of the larger community that in which the church is located. So we used to, but she retired.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and I also think that a parish nurse isn't necessarily the thing, right? There's lots of ways to do this. And if you had a parish nurse, her role would mainly be referring people to other resources. But not every parish is going to be able to take on a salary and so on. So you have to have you have to be able to figure out other things to do.
Okay, thank you. One of our other guests asked a couple questions. I'll take them individually. First of all, how do we support the caregivers of those who have dementia? And I know this was referred to earlier, but are there specific ways we can help the caregivers?
I think we should pray with them, and we should pray for them. I think that's one thing parishes can do. But I also think we should know them, acknowledge them, and I think caregivers understand each other. And so creating a group, there's all kinds of groups in any parish. There's Holy Name Societies and Catholic Women's League and the Knights of Columbus, a group of people who are caregivers who can meet and share their burdens, their challenges, their problems, their questions. I think that might go a long way.
Yeah, exactly. And it presupposes that they can get to those meetings, which is very often, right, a very basic problem. If there isn't, so often it's a husband looking after a wife or vice versa. And they don't always have family who can just fill the gap. But again, there are some resources. I mean, some people say there's not enough, and I guess that's always the case, but there are some in terms of that respite care. But I think the question of parishes could maybe come in there too, in terms of volunteers. We volunteer, to let people go, the caregivers go to their meetings, which, as you're saying, Michael, it's so helpful for people to discuss similar problems, and also then they get advice and other ideas, as well as just sort of being able to vent for a while, because that's a very necessary part for many people. But I think, I do think that in our parishes, it's a very practical approach. I agree about prayer. I think the idea of masses or special liturgies or something would be wonderful. Like healing masses every so often, it's not always easy to do, but some of our parishes could do more than they already are. But I think, just as it was an interesting statistic to me anyway, that before the pandemic, I'm lost, I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Before the pandemic, the hospice volunteers, it was the highest growing sector in volunteerism. So there's something already there in terms of people wanting to help, and presumably the same thing could happen with something like this, helping caregivers in a parish.
Thank you. Thank you. Father John, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just I think, again, in agreeing with Michael and Maura, oftentimes speaking with people, especially family members, and maybe it's a child not, taking care of their elderly parent who may suffer from dementia. Oftentimes, in the conversation and what they're saying, even if it's in the confessional, like there's a great sense that they're just so burned out, like they just feel so stuck in a way. So any support, any guidance, I think would be of great help, because again, just hearing their conversations, hearing their remarks, hearing their struggles, it just feels like the burden of everything is exclusively upon them. And again, it's not just in our context to absolve and say, good luck or something like that, but to also provide some help, some support, some encouragement in some direction.
Thank you. Just interesting question here. Sister Nuala Kenny is one of our authors. She's joining us today from Halifax. Sister Nuala has written on a lot of these issues herself, and she has asked if she could ask her question here. So, Sister Nuala, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. So first, let me say I had an opportunity to read Mike's book, and I've written him back with lots of comments, mainly saying this is a gem, and I'm very happy that he did it. And I'm even proud of him as a non-doctor for how beautifully he's interpreted some of the medical facts here. So I appreciate the comments that Father that we've heard from Maura, but I thought that I would emphasize three things, if I might. First, I know for sure of the speakers, and you, Joe, I'm the only one who's participating in this call from a long-term care facility in lockdown. I live in the Sisters of Charity retirement home, Caritas, which is in a public retirement facility. So I want you to know that from this experience, things really seem very different. And having been someone who's a university professor, important cognitive skills, to living where the average age is 86, and we just had the birthday of the third person in our house, sister who is over 100. So I just want to emphasize from this perspective first, the urgency that we see in Michael's first chapter, and I agree it is there, and properly so, Mike. I don't think that the magnitude of what's been learned in pandemic was really emphasized enough here. Look, pandemic revealed that in this aging population, even in the developed West, the total inadequacy of care for the elderly living alone and the elderly living in institutions has been one of the most damaging experiences in pandemic. Where did most of the deaths come? I mean, you have had the huge numbers of deaths in long-term care facilities right across our country in the United States. And this is all because of the inadequacy of resources for long-term and residential care, and our focus on acute care or fix-oriented rather than care-oriented medicine. So I just want to emphasize, pandemic showed us that the urgency is not theoretical, it's real, it's here right now, and it has been experienced. Second, this issue of people saying, you know, I go to visit my mother, but she's not the person she once was. And the theological implications, we heard all three making some beautiful comments about this. What I want to share with you is, in my book on the care of the dying, in the chapter on aging, a philosophy colleague, feminist philosopher colleague of mine, made a contribution that I think is crucial to us as a community. She talks about identity, who we are as being, first of all, in our faith, it's intrinsic. Just because you feel undignified stuff is happening doesn't mean you ever lose your dignity, and we need to emphasize that. But in relation to identity, my colleague Francoise Baylis says relational identity is about three things. It's about memory, it's about belonging, and it's about recognition. And what I want to say here is, I think one of the amazing things that happens is that we begin, and I see it with visitors here, both to our sisters and to the lay people who are in my facility. When we're in the prime of life, that the experience of recognition is mutual. Hi, Mom. Hi, Nuala. Hi, Joe. Hi, Nuala. It's mutual. As this cognitive decline occurs, what we begin to see is that the memory now is no longer shared. The belonging now has to be created by an acceptance that recognition now shifts to be not mutual, but the burden of recognition and the obligation that follows from that. So don't you remember, Mom? And if she doesn't remember, it makes no difference. You're there, present, and retrieving the sense of memory and belonging now, though you're assuming almost all of the burden of recognition. And third, crucial issue has not been addressed here. We are talking about care of the elderly, not only in this time of pandemic with all its lessons, but in the time where medically assisted death in this country has been normalized. I mean, and Moira and I could tell you battles that we've been into with regard to medically assisted death, opposition to it, opposition. The point I want to make here is that if faith communities cannot find ways to support the dignity, identity, and belonging of the elderly. They are at such grave risk of being seen as easily expendable. They would be better off dead, is the language that you hear from many. And the way in which Bill C7, Bill C14 have played out, we're still in a precarious situation with regard to protection of even the lives of these individuals. And I agree with Maura. I love Pope Francis. I have a few issues I'd like to speak to him about with regard to women, but I love Pope Francis. And I love the fact that he loved his nonna. He loved his grandparents. So he, in fact, is constantly asking us to recognize. He says that a people who forgets their ancestors has no future because it forgets our roots. So the issues here, Mike, I'm so glad that you brought it together, and I thank the two other panelists for dealing with this. But these are serious issues that are revealed in Care of the Elderly.
There's one thing, Nola, that I read since finishing the book that I wish I could kind of include in there. There's a doctor who recently said that the experience of quality of life that people who already have dementia is much higher than the quality of life they predicted for themselves. We live in fear of this disease and what it will do to us and who we will become. But if you actually talk to the people who are living with the disease and ask them, how are you today? Well, how are you doing? How's your life? They come up with higher scores than we do in our fear of the disease. And I think much of our drive to euthanasia has been fueled by fear. It's now possible to decide that you will be euthanized because you have dementia. And I think we desperately need to, as parishes, to show a counterexample.
Yeah.
To show that that life is worth living.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you too, Nuala, for your contribution there. Those are definitely essential points, and I'm glad you brought them up. I really appreciate it. It really helped to expand our discussion here this afternoon. We're getting very close to our hour of closing, and I have so many questions from people that would like to get them in. If, with your permission of our panelists, do you mind if we go for a couple more minutes? That's okay? Okay, because there's a couple in particular. One I want to read to you because I think this is very important. This is from one of our attendees. I am an Anglican priest, age 67, diagnosed with dementia almost a year ago. I have shared my diagnosis with my bishop and my small congregation, who have been very supportive. Any thoughts on knowing when I should stop doing my duties? I am their priest in charge. This is making it real.
Yeah, I think so. I had an email also from somebody who, just this week, who has spent a lot of time thinking about dementia because she now has the diagnosis. And so I offered to send her my book, and she said, well, don't send me your book. I can't read books anymore. Gave away all my books. I think it's a case where you rely on the people around you. You should ask your parishioners, how am I doing? You should ask your bishop. Don't try to make that decision for yourself or by yourself. If we're a community, we should be able to rely on each other.
Thank you.
Nuala may confirm this about the differences these days if Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia are caught fairly early. As funnily enough, coincidentally, I too was talking today to somebody who just had a diagnosis. He's 78, and the doctors he has seen have been kind of hopeful. And so saying that some of the medications are much more effective than, say, 10 or 12 years ago. I don't know from a medical point of view if that's true, but I don't think they were just trying to keep the fellow's hopes up. I think this was they were sort of trying to help him. They were being candid and sort of seeing how being able to keep some of the symptoms now from progressing, keeping them at bay, so to speak, that in many ways, for many people, because I know you can never generalize, but the future is a lot better than it would have been quite a few years ago, which I think is medically hopeful, but obviously personally for people hopeful as well. And I agree with Michael, as long as we're still kind of aware, just as to how much we actually are aware, and then we might get to the stage, because it seems to be also true that people in early stage dementia are very self-aware and begin to realize themselves when they're not. Again, I know you can't generalize, but it's very often the case. So I think I'm just saying, it's so hard to say at a certain stage you have to quit, at a certain stage you don't. But maybe as in retirement in general, people often say, when it's the right time. I hope that's the case, but I think there maybe is some, human wisdom to that. And so I would just think, stay hopeful and go along with the medical diagnosis, as well as helpful colleagues who'll point out to you when you're maybe somehow not just carrying out your duties the way maybe once upon a time we were able to. I think it sounds pretty hopeful, actually.
Yeah, and I would just add myself that, as Sister Nuala spoke of, with regard to the emphasizing the dignity of the person. As a Jesuit, sometimes I can see some of our men, they kind of age very gracefully, if you will, and others sort of go kicking and screaming. And so our dignity, our value is not nearly, as we all know, it's not just a result of what we can produce, of how well we may preside at Mass, or how well one's newest book is, or how they preach, what have you. But that it is given to us by God in our creation, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that dignity can never be removed or lessened. So I think reminding ourselves and others of that can allow people perhaps a greater freedom when things develop in their life, that they're more free to let some things, to put them down, and to look for other ways of serving their community, of serving the Lord, or what have you.
Thank you. Well, listen, we're now beyond an hour, and I promised early on that we would take you here for an hour and then let you carry on with the many other busy aspects of your life. So I'm going to draw this session to a close rather reluctantly, because there are so many different questions that we could pursue. But I want to thank everyone who's joined us this afternoon for your participation. I especially want to thank our panelists, Moira McQueen, Father John Sullivan. Thank you for sharing from your experience and knowledge this afternoon. And thank you in particular, Michael, for your sharing about your book and the wisdom that it has taught you and working on that. I am just going to share my screen again, just so you will see, if you want to buy the book, how you can get your hands on it. You can find it here at our website, www.novalis.ca. There's a code. I'm going to give you a second if you want to write this down. So that's it for this afternoon. I just want to call this session to a close. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks to all of you. Take care. Bye.